I wanted to first thank Rachel, Angela, Brent, and everyone else who invited me here today. It's great to be in Providence. Providence and Hartford, where I live now, actually have a lot in common. And from the presentations that I was listening to earlier about everything that's happening here, we have one thing we don't have in common, which is while we have a great local group, it seems like this group is even more expansive in its reach and scope, and it's very impressive what you all have been doing. And so I hope my talk today can just help to supplement and maybe continue to push you in the direction that you're already going. I think is there a slide advancer here? Sorry. Thank you so much. So the title of my talk, and I actually didn't even realize it was the day after the State of the Union. So I watched last night intently, and President Trump started talking about, he used the phrase, that we will preserve our great building heritage. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is the moment. This is what I'm going to hinge on, on every word that he's hang on every word that he's talking about here. It turned out that he was talking about federal infrastructure projects and new roads and new highways and things like that. But we were so close to getting historic preservation in the State of the Union address, I thought I might mention it. So it falls to me to provide you with State of the Union for historic preservation, and drawing from a phrase from last night, beautiful, clean preservation. And that's what I'm going to report on today. So, I guess presidents often say, it's my pleasure to report that the State of the Union is strong. And I wish I could say it's my pleasure to report that the state of preservation is strong. It's strongish. It could be stronger. There's always room for improvement. But we face some challenges, and I'll talk about a few of these challenges, and also some places where we can all continue to be involved in the future. So I want to first talk about a few issues at the federal level, and as I said, move to local governments, back down to the local level and local activism to promote preservation. So you might have thought that this particular president had a very strong interest in preservation. As it turns out, he's actually a real estate developer, as you probably know, done a lot of historic preservation tax credits, and brings a very, a history, personal history that's very much in line with rehabilitation projects. Most recently, the old post office. People know this building, right? Anybody ever trekked down to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which was actually located in this building? It went up for auction. President Trump's organization bought it, and he used $32 million of federal preservation tax credits for this building. Well, I should say they're pledged. He just needs to submit the Part 3, but it's presumably coming. So even if he didn't have an intense interest in preservation based on his own projects, you might have thought, well, the preservation tax credit itself, again, a hallmark of the preservation movement and the preservation achievements on the federal level, is something that's actually been advanced by Republicans. There's a great video that if we had a little more time, I might have played tonight. It's just a couple minutes. But it's from Republican hero, President Ronald Reagan, who was himself a champion of historic preservation tax credits. In this video, and I can't imitate him, but he says, with this one initiative, we help to send tax dollars back into your communities. Our tax credits have made the preservation of our older buildings not only a matter of respect for beauty and history, but of good economic sense. So you see a president here, embracing this idea of preservation being good for our economy, as well as being good for our communities. So, with that background, I focus on the tax credits first because it has really been one of the hot button issues here on an activism level and on the federal level. So the proposal, for those of you who missed it, was to completely eliminate the federal historic preservation tax credit. So how many people were active in advocacy in that over the last year, right? So you've gotten engaged in that effort. And the truth is that this proposal came out of Congress, not from the White House. But of course, it's, we're talking about a somewhat of a year in review. And it was very much in danger of being eliminated. Everyone was up in arms about this. So you had the National Trust, you see a screenshot of their advocacy piece. I did another screenshot of the New Orleans Preservation Resource Center and Preserve Rhode Island as well, who got involved, and of course Providence Preservation Society did as well. So what happened here in the last 2 months was that all of this advocacy turned the tide, and in the tax plan that was finalized, the preservation tax credit was restored. So advocates saved the tax credit. The 20% credit still exists. It's being phased in over 5 years as opposed to a quicker phase in now. The 10% tax credit for properties before 1936 has been eliminated, but people feel very, very strong about the victory in advocating for the tax credit to be included in the tax plan. So, lesson number one, I guess, is in the Trump era, advocacy still matters, so your voice still matters. Here in Rhode Island, many projects have benefited from the tax credit, so I'm sure you recognize this as the South Street Station. We just pulled it together a few slides just to see how the tax credit hits home. $140 million project, federal tax credits used here, plus state tax credits of about $32 million. So it's important to note that the federal tax credit is often joined with state tax credits. You're very lucky here in Rhode Island. I helped SHPO do a study, the State Historic Preservation Office in Connecticut do a study. Here in Rhode Island, you often do more projects and in greater dollar amounts than Connecticut does. So you're very blessed to have the program that you have here. Another project that your tax credits and federal tax credits have come into play. Again, you see the before and afters of the water fire headquarters, part of the U.S. Rubber Company complex. Total project cost was $11 million, but still tax credits are a pretty important part of this. So you don't have to read all of that. It's just notes for people who are extremely interested. But the point of this slide is just to say that a lot of states, possibly in response to constraints on the federal tax credit, have this year, in the last year, expanded through legislation their own tax credits. So while you have the federal federal scene somewhat in flux, you have states that have actually stepped up to expand the tax credits. More have stepped up to expand the tax credits in different ways, for example, making other new projects eligible for tax credits, increasing the amount that's budgeted for tax credits, increasing the percentage amount for tax credits, than those who have contracted their tax credits. You see a few of those contractions happening in Virginia, Missouri, and Wisconsin. So lesson number two, I guess, state law matters. A lot of work is being done at the state level, and this makes sense given the way our federal framework for preservation has been set up. Okay, so that's one topic, is the tax credits. I wanted to turn now to a different topic. Anybody know where this is? So this is, I hear it from the back, Bears Ears, for a couple slides. And how about this? These next two slides are from Grand Stairs Escalante Monument. So have people heard about these two issues in advocacy circles? Anybody shop at Patagonia? Anybody been online recently? I'll show you a slide on this in a second. Another big issue in federal preservation matters right now has been these two sites, as well as the broader question that these two sites have raised, which is what is the president's power to shrink monuments under the Antiquities Act. So the Antiquities Act was a law passed in 1906. Then President Theodore Roosevelt, as you know, noted conservationist, who said, we need something, Congress needs to pass a law that allows me, the president, to create national monuments. And since 1906, the Antiquities Act has never really been revised. The language in the Act, see, did I put? I'll tell you the language in the Act in a second. But first, looks like I got cut off a little bit. But the proposal that's being discussed right now by advocacy groups as well as in the White House, and this is a proposal from the White House, is to shrink the size of these two national monuments that have been created. You can see, possibly you can see the black outlines on the image on the right. The image on the left is the second site, but the shaded in, the hatched in areas are the areas that would essentially remain from these national monuments. So a large portion of them would be eliminated under the president's proposal to shrink these monuments. And he's proceeded with doing this, and these are maps that were leaked. The Antiquities Act says here, as you can see here, that the president is hereby authorized in his discretion to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The limits of the site shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management. There's nothing in here that says the president can uncreate or undesignate a national monument. So the question for legal scholars, and I guess I'm one of those, a law professor, I guess we think about these things and we look at the words of statutes and we say, well, there's nothing in here that says the president can contract a national monument once it's created. Congress can amend it potentially, but right now there's nothing in that. So we've had 5 cases come to court already on Trump's decision to shrink these monuments. And again, you don't have to read all of these. The idea is just to get the gist of the fact that there's a lot of cases that are coming into federal courts to try to block this action. This is actually very controversial. Patagonia has gotten involved in this matter, and on their main website, you can see this is from Patagonia. The president stole Bear Ears National Monument. Okay, so since when do you see a commercial company, getting involved in advocacy? As a law professor, I never thought in my lifetime that I would see the Antiquities Act be the subject of a popular campaign, but here you go. This is what folks are talking about these days. So you have, anybody know who these folks are? In response to some of the concerns and about where preservation is going at the federal level, in response to this idea of this controversy over presidential power in the Antiquities Act, you have National Park Service Advisory Council resigning, except for these, they're left, giving advice up in D.C., and I'm sure to be replaced. But you do have a sense right now that there's some concerns. So I'll bring back to lesson number 1. In the Trump era, advocacy still matters. We hope, for those who care about historic landscapes, the Antiquities Act question is going to be continue to be a hot button issue. So, as a law professor, one of the things I look at, and for historic preservation law is very important, as you know. One of the things I look at is what's happening in the courts. So, looking at what's happening in the courts right now, there's a lot of cases. We pulled up some circuit cases, and here's some of the names of them. There has not been a lot of change right now in the way that the courts are treating preservation cases that come before them. So you have the same kind of run-of-the-mill cases that deal with the National Historic Preservation Act, and is something an undertaking? Did the federal agency follow procedures? Or Section 4F, a transportation law that deals with whether departments of transportation should or should not have demolished historic buildings when they were building roads. You still see those kinds of cases coming into play, and you see courts. There's not been a trend in courts that's, let's say, very pro-property rights or something along those lines that might be the hallmarks of a shift in Washington. One of the cases, in fact, the last case on the previous slide, the Center for Biological Diversity case versus Mattis, has been, the subject of this case is the protection of the Okinawa dugong, which is a national and cultural treasure designated in Japan under Japanese law. And the Army is building bases and expanding infrastructure in Okinawa. And the question in these cases has been whether the dugong deserves protection under our federal preservation framework. And so the latest case, this case that I'm at the very bottom of the slide, and that might have gotten cut off, or maybe it's there somewhere. Okay, it is that so far the Center for Biological Diversity does have the right to be in court to sue on behalf of the dugong. But there are interesting cases out there. This, again, an animal being protected by the Historic Preservation Act. We're not seeing a lot of changes here in how the courts have treated this case, and there's been a number of cases involving the dugong over the years. Okay, so that's some very big picture thoughts on what's happening, the trends right now, and concerns at the federal level. couple of things that are happening at the state level, but I wanted to focus now on local level, the area that you guys work on a lot, and just to touch again on some things that local governments are doing and can continue to do on this issue. So the three big topics I wanted to just touch on today: designation, regulation, and zoning. You think zoning, but I'll explain. So everybody knows here what the designation process is about. So you have in Providence properties that are designated on historic registers of places, the local register, the state register, and the national register, of course. To be designated, a property has to have significance, it has to have integrity. Significance can be it can be found in a number of different things. So building on the top left, right, okay, so significance of Mount Vernon is associated with a significant person. The image on the top right, actually same site, but it's a reconstructed slave cabin. There's a reconstruction of what they think it looks like. It has some secondary significance and is something that we don't have originals of, but is still part of this historic milieu. Down below, places in buildings. I took these pictures in Washington, D.C., I guess back before D.C. was booming about 10 years ago. These are buildings that you might not think qualify for historic status given their current condition or then current condition. But integrity does not necessarily mean that you have to be pristine. It just means that you have to have the possibility of I guess, being revived. And so all of these buildings that you see are listed on mostly National Register districts in Washington, D.C. So anyway, the designation process takes into account a lot of different factors, but there are certainly things that you might be surprised but can be designated. So just thinking about your endangered properties list, I'm sure most of those or all of those are actually designated historic, but designation is the first step to protection. So the second big category of things local governments do is regulation. So here they regulate in a variety of areas. They might regulate how properties might be demolished, or in this case, demolition by neglect. They might regulate whether alterations might be permitted on property. So sure, your historic commission all the time deals with alterations to properties, and this one you can probably see right off the bat that the one-story addition to this house looks a little funny, it looks a little off. Sometimes you might not be able to define it in law, but local governments and local commissions, maybe it's like pornography, or what's the phrase? You can tell when you see it that something doesn't look quite right. Usually at the local level, we regulate exterior appearances. We don't regulate the interiors, but there's been a few cases, including in New York City, whose Landmark Commission does allow interior designations, about the scope of those designations. I think there was the restaurant at the Four Seasons where they wanted to change the interior so that they could have a coat rack and reconfigure the entrance, and they were told that they could not. So there's certainly additional cases that are coming through on that. New construction too. So what you can see on the right here is probably the image that is best to see here. There's a question about whether this new construction is appropriate with the row houses that are around it. It's innovative anyway. Or you can get something like this, which is a photo from a street 2 streets away from me in Hartford, where you have a beautiful building here. So this red building in the middle, which is a new building, Feng, a great, actually, sushi restaurant. The building to its left is historic. Look at the top. And then you have this as an alteration, but there's the new infill potentially in the middle. And then you have the building to its right, which has 2 stories shown, and then the bottom, a disaster. But this is before we had designated, these properties as historic, and at this point they probably cannot really be designated historic. On the other hand, the restoration of the building on the corner is a beautiful restoration done by a bank for that building. So anyway, historic commissions regulate properties and regulate alterations, hopefully to avoid some of the things that we've just seen. So last few minutes I wanted to spend on zoning, and you might say, how is zoning a tool to be used for preservation? So I think it's actually going to be the tool that we have to rely on more and more to ensure compatible development within properties. And I wanted to use Hartford as an example. Providence has a relatively new zoning code, and it's form-based code. I think it passed in 2014. So parts are form-based. And I just wanted to flip through a few images of Hartford. So here's Pratt Street. Here's what we call a perfect six. I know you have these here too. A beautiful neighborhood in the West End. Park Street, a busy commercial corridor in Central Hartford. We have great bus transportation. This is bikes, Connecticut Fast Track. There I am with my husband, who's the mayor of Hartford, and our kids celebrating bike-friendly community designations. So in other words, we're a compact city with bikes. We have beautiful natural resources. Actually, the first public park in the country, lower right, and lower left, the first municipal rose garden in the country, Elizabeth Park, for those of you who've been to Hartford. The Connecticut River runs along our eastern border. That's the top right. So we really do have a beautiful city worth preserving. Let me turn. Perfect. So in 2016, we passed a new zoning code, and what we really prioritized was the historic districts in the city, trying to characterize all of them, trying to codify the types of buildings that we saw, which of course had not been codified before. A consultant at Codometrics helped us do this. Here you just see a few images of the building types that we have in Hartford. We turn these into charts that show what kinds of building types are allowed in which neighborhoods. Here's a residential chart. The prior one was a commercial chart. And then we created sheets that tell you what kinds of buildings we have. Mostly what you see in our zoning code are pictures of historic buildings. And so here are the house type buildings. We'll focus in on the middle house type B. And then we created regulations that required new construction to be built in a way that's compatible with the historic fabric. So in the neighborhoods where you have these buildings on the left, you can see just off the slide, they have to have pitched roofs. They have to have porches. They have to be 2.5 to 3 stories tall. They have to have usually wood materials or brick, and they have to be situated on the lot in the same way as the other houses around. So they have to be built up to the same building line. So this is something we can regulate through zoning that's not necessarily regulated by historic preservation. So here are 2 streets in Hartford. This is Oxford Street. This is Kenyon Street. Do you see any differences between these 2 streets? Not really, right? So, but if you look at the historic district map on the left, and again, you might not be able to see it, but the white patch in the middle is where Oxford Street is. It's not regulated, it's not designated a historic district for whatever reason. Maybe that block of property owners just decided they didn't want to go through the designation process. Whereas in the zoning map on the right, it's treated the same way as all of the neighboring blocks. So Oxford and Kenyon Street are literally right next to each other and in parallel, and extremely similar in terms of the building types. So I guess I would just say zoning, and I know Providence has started to embrace this as well, but zoning and zoning regulations is another way that local governments, I think, will start to protect their vernacular properties and their neighborhoods that may or may not actually have formal designation protection in the coming years. So I'll repeat, local governments matter, and in the Trump era. And in any era, you matter. You matter as advocates. Your voice really matters, and it makes a difference, even when you don't think it's making a difference at every level of government and in every decision that's being made. So I think with that, I'm supposed to open it up for a few questions and comments. Great. Thank you so much.